say that I've seen it a lot, so I don't watch it every night. But I always notice something different when I see it. It's like a glance that goes all the way across the stage or something like that. I was just like being over here in the wings and at the end of Cross-Eyed and Painless and hearing Bernie's incredibly perfect clavinet part. It's like, oh, isn't that cool, you know? And it has all these little tidbits of that you'll grasp onto, and then you go to another place. This one of the things that was so great about this band is that how disciplined everybody was. Is that we had all those people on stage, but people were not really trying to show off or like trying to, well, maybe with the exception of Steve Scales. Steve was a big presence, and I think that one of the great things about Chris and Tina and I was like, we wanted everybody else in the band to have as much fun as possible and to shine. And it was back then it was not that, it was unusual to have black and white men and women. We were trying to be political. We just thought that this would be a great show, but it was still a statement of sort of unifying, and it's just fun just and it was also really fun to do the restoration when the reason it happened actually is because we owned the movie, and we took all the money that we had made on that tour to bankroll the movie. And so our deal with Palm Pictures was coming up, and we realized we wanted sort of some new blood. And so we were in touch with a number of companies. We were so delighted that A24 came in, and they did such a good job. And we're really, let's make sure we get the negative. And fortunately, we found all of the pieces. There was this one part of the audio, because we were having a problem with sync, that ended up being in a warehouse in Kansas owned by MGM, which MGM had nothing to do with this film, or any of the companies that had to do with it. It was just fortunate that we found it. And my engineer, E.T. Thorngren, E.T. and I mixed the album of Stop Making Sense, not the original movie. And then in '99, when we put out the DVD, he was involved with that. So he was intimately familiar, but the minute we signed the deal, I said, E.T., we have to start now, because something's gonna go wrong. This is gonna be a bigger project than we think. And it was good that we did, because there were problems that developed, but also just coming back to it and going like, maybe we can do a little bit more here. And it's I think you'll agree that it's never looked better and never sounded better, and you find out new things. And I think I think there's another really interesting thing is that Sandy McLeod, who was sort of Jonathan's assistant, traveled with us, and she was writing notes, copious notes, and it would be something interesting happens in Making Flippy Floppy at stage left, so make sure we have a camera there, and something like this. And so it was a little bit like a shot list for Jonathan to begin with. We shot this over 4 days at the Pantages Theater, and because we wanted to have enough of an audience, everybody knew that they were coming to a filming, but we had one night we had the dolly go this way, and one was over there, and one over there, and then we picked which musical performance was the best, and those what we spliced together, and then we edited to that. And this brings up one of the questions we had. We were able to, let's say, make it look as good as, maybe better than it's ever looked, and sound better than it's ever sounded, but there are places where the sync goes off because it's a shot from one night being, for another performance, and we did not play to a click track. I mean, Chris is an amazingly steady drummer, but it's not artificially, he would get a click to start the song, but it would wander a little bit. And we could have used digital tools now to fix the sync, but it was sort of like, I think that was like a bridge too far of changing it. it might have been an interesting, it would have been a very expensive experiment tonight, yes. So we didn't do that. But I think that, David pointed this out in one of the get-togethers where it was all four of us, is that Jonathan, I think, sort of saw this as almost like an ensemble in the way that actors, and there's these little dialogues going on, and it was so important to capture those. I mean, you'll notice that an awful lot of this is close footage. It's not long distance shots. And it's moving around and grasping things and kind of telling this story. And you'll see that, there's a place where Tina and Alex are dancing, or Alex and I are dancing, or, when Steve comes down and is singing with Lynn and Edna. There's these little interactions between the musicians that are telling a little story, and so that was the sort of things that Sandy was writing down, and that it's sort of, we're moving around to these interesting things, and so you really get to know every person in the band in a sort of an intimate way. You see them up close and having such a good time. David, worked out his basic dance moves, like these kind of things, and he got a video camera, and then he invited Lynn and Edna over, and they go, we can do that, not that one. But the rest of us, we just sort of danced the way we dance because it was so much fun to dance. But things would happen over the course of, I think it was largely a summer and then into the fall, that where, like, that worked last night, let's do it again. And so by the time we got to the Pantages, it was sort of like a choreography happened by playing the show so many times. And I love some of those shots where you're at, like, in Found a Job or at the side of the stage, and you can see this kind of, three of us, Tina, David, and I, moving back and forth in our own sort of worlds, but, this composite, because you're at the side. And of course, the fact that Jordan Cronenworth was the director of photography who had done Blade Runner, which of course all of us were really, oh my God, and he just did such an amazing job. And his son, who's now a director of photography, was brought in to approve the color balancing and the rescan. So we kind of kept it going. So with that, why don't we open, so that gives a little bit of the story of what we did, and why don't we open it up to questions now? And do we have a mic out here, or is everybody goes? So I think we're going to, okay, well, why don't I take yours? But we're going to have some mics up, a microphone over here, but I'll take yours. What is it?
So when you guys were doing, how did you come across meeting Adrian Ballou and everyone else?
So the question is how do we get to know Adrian Ballou? And so this is the sort of third band of the big bands. The first one, which we put together for Romantic Light, that actually I put together, that Adrian was in. Adrian had played with Frank Zappa and was in Europe, and Eno went to see Frank Zappa and then told David Bowie about Adrian. And then there's a very funny story about that, but well, this is really far from stop making sense, but okay, so I don't know, Adrian's wearing a dress playing with Frank Zappa, and he looks over and there's Iggy Pop and David Bowie over in the wings. And he comes over and like introduces himself, and he goes, David goes, well, we'd like to go out to dinner, but this is a little bit awkward, so Adrian went back to the hotel, and when you're at the hotel, there will be a car outside, and go out to the car, and it'll take us to where we're gonna go, so anyway, he went through all of this, and they're in this limo together, and they go to a restaurant, and who's at the restaurant but Frank Zappa? And David says, hi Frank, nice to see you, and he goes, you too, Captain Tom. Frank had demoted him from major. So anyway, Eno had told us about him, about Adrian. And then when we did a swing, I think on the Fair of Music tour, he was living in Champaign-Urbana, and he came to about 3 shows. And on the last one, we asked him to sit in on Psycho Killer. And then he was playing, I remember at the Mud Club. He says at Irving Plaza, but I think I'm right. But we went down when we were working in New York, and he always describes it as he came up and there were no lyrics at this point, and we kind of were set him up, and he goes, well, you know, this is really kind of, it's just kind of grooves. And he goes like, when you feel like there might be a solo, start playing. Stop when you feel like you ought to stop. And then at the end, come in again. And so, and the solo for The Great Curve, which I think is one of the greatest solos he ever did, was the first take. It was just amazing. So he always says that like whatever, his equipment worked well, the room, the feedback, everything worked really, really well. I think all of you know that I've been touring with him and doing these shows, and I will do a little plug. We are playing at the Guild Theater in Menlo Park on March, I believe, 26th and 27th. So I hope all of you can find a way to come. It's a great show. All right, let's go to Stop Making Sense. And there's a microphone there, and I think people can line up. So thank you.
So I don't know that mine is very sophisticated or anything. I'm hoping that you can help me with my memory, and maybe there's a question out of that. So I saw you in the band towards the end of your tour at UC Davis, which was a relatively small venue at the time. And we tried to get you guys to play at the beginning of the tour, but your stage requirements were such that it couldn't fit in that small of a venue. And at the end, we thought better, and we pulled out a bunch of seats to squeeze the stage in there. And so my question is, what was the typical, how big were the venues typically? Because I felt where we saw you was a relatively small venue, and feel fortunate that it was. And then how many shows did you do on this tour?
You know, I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I thought you might, I was hoping you might remind me.
We were, you know, usually 5 days on, 1 day off, 5 days on for months. You know, I think that we played the Greek Theater in LA and the Greek Theater here. And, we also played some of the sheds, sort of like Shoreline, but in other parts of the country. Those were sort of our favorite places in the summer because, well, also the idea with the lawn is that the audience could just expand. And back then, as my manager would say, you could buy a ticket on the lawn for less than you pay for the parking today. Which I think made people a little bit more like, I'm gonna take a flyer or a chance on this. So yeah, you know, there were some civic centers and some other things like that. It was a really varied tour. It wasn't, my favorite actually though, we played the Forest Hills Tennis Stadium. We'd done it the tour before it. The old Forest Hills Tennis Stadium is like this theater, kind of a steep slope. So you can feel 15,000 people aren't that far away. You know, it's really great when the audience feels close to you. You know, I think that every musician will go like, yeah, it's exciting when you play to these gigantic audiences, but it's really great playing in a club or a small theater where you can see people's faces and you can see that they're there. It's one of the things I liked when I played Hardly Strictly is that nobody, you know, a lot of times I feel like there has to be barriers, and it was like, everybody's cool here, it's not gonna be a problem, and you know, and there wasn't. It was just people are like really close. So anyway, next question. Well, okay, I'll have to repeat. Yeah. So I don't know if anybody heard them other than me. So the first question was, how do we all meet? Second one was, did David write the lyrics? And did we work 80 hours a week like Malcolm Gladwell recommends? So, David, Chris, and Tina went to Rhode Island School of Design, and Chris and David had a band there called the Artistics. David dropped out, but he stayed hanging around in Rhode Island and in Providence, and then they all kind of moved to New York. Chris and Tina were already a couple at that time, and Chris and Dave started playing together again, and I think that either they couldn't find a bass player, and then Tina said, well, why don't I play bass? And then I think David taught her to play bass a bit. She had played some other kind of like a flute or something like that. She, nothing, but not a stringed instrument before that. And she became such a remarkable bass player. And so they were a trio, and we got a lot of press. And I had been in the band The Modern Lovers, and had spent time here in Berkeley, and the record that Berkeley Records came out, which was the demo tapes that The Modern Lovers made in 1972, actually came out in 1976, and it was sort of a blueprint for a lot of the punk bands, because it sort of had the same ethos. And so the Talking Heads heard that, and Ernie Brooks, who was the bass player of The Modern Lovers, aunt and uncle knew Chris's parents in Pittsburgh, and they got my phone number and they called me up, and so that's how I met them. The rest of the band, I'd been hanging around with Busta Jones in New York and had a band with him called the Escalators at some off time of Talking Heads after Fear of Music, and Dolette McDonald was in that band, and so we got the offer to play 2 shows that we were going to make more money. One up at Mossport outside of Toronto, a festival there, and then in Central Park. And so we said, let's see if we can play this music that we just created, because we knew we couldn't do it as a 4-piece because there were so many layers of music. Because the composition, so this is for Remain in Light, and so it's like, we need percussion, background singing. Another guitar player, another keyboard player. Oh my God, we need another bass player. And so I called up Busta and Dolette. They were the beginning, and then I had met Bernie through Busta. And of course, I talked about Adrian, who we knew. And then we found Steve Scales. And I came back to the studio, I left, and 3 hours later, I'm like, we have the best band in the world. And so we did the 2 shows, and it was like, we can't go back. That's how it started. Now, David wrote the huge majority of the lyrics. In the very beginning, Chris wrote the lyrics to Warning Sign. Tina wrote the French part in Psycho Killer. And I think that Chris wrote a few other ones on the first album, but it sort of became David's province pretty quickly. On some records, he wrote a song, and then we added our parts, and on certainly Remain in Light, Speaking in Tongues, and Naked, we sort of composed it all together. And then I co-wrote some songs with him on Fear of Music. Last, did we work for 80 hours a week? We worked very hard. I don't know about 80 hours. It's hard to practice 80 hours. They were very disciplined and they just had their life together. The Modern Lovers were much more, I don't know, maybe it was, Ernie Brooks is late all the time, and I'd gotten used to being late. And I remember I was a little bit late for one of the first Talking Heads rehearsals, and they all looked at their watches. And I didn't have a watch. It was like, I better get a watch. So I went out and bought one of those Casio watches, and I was never late again. Okay, next question.
Hi, thank you for doing this. It's hard when you look at it to realize that was 40 years ago that they were watching there, and it brought me back to remembering when I first heard your music 40 years ago, and actually it was my sister playing it, and I was like, what the hell are you playing? So what was it that you were trying to do, or you weren't trying to do, but just happened, that made your sound so much, well, that shocked me, but it was so different at the time? The Talking Heads were a whole new sound, and I'd spent the 70s listening to other stuff. Did you think about what you were trying to sound like? Is this just what when you guys got together, that's when it happened. How did the Talking Heads sound the way they sounded?
Well, for me, they were a trio that they already sounded the way they sounded. But, I think that there was, first of all, it's like, we're not going to be about the blues. The blues were really influential back then. And it's like, no, we're not going to be about that. We're going to be edgier. We're more about art. Velvet Underground was an influence. And everybody in the band really loved R&B music. And I think when we put out the first album, everyone goes like, what are their influences? We don't get it. And we put out the second record, when we included Take Me to the River, everyone goes, oh, right, that's the influence. And then Chris is such a steady and terrific drummer, but he also never overplays. He leaves all this space. And I think that this is one of the things you see here, is again, the space that's being left. The people, if they didn't have something to play, they didn't play it. Or you could, sometimes there are parts where I'm playing, it's just like do dee do dee do 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 dee do dee do do, or like in E Zimbra, which is not, it's in the Blu-ray of this, but not, we didn't say it's going like dee 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 do dee 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 do dee for the whole song. And so we would do these things that I think a lot of other bands would feel like, oh, I'm getting bored, I gotta go do something else, or I gotta put a couple extra licks in, or a power chord, or something, And I think that sensibility is somewhat something that comes from the visual arts. I've always thought that in the visual arts, particularly at that time period, people would put highly contrasting things together as a way to be really dramatic. And I think that rubbed off on our music, so that if you think of a song like Artist Only, the parts of the song don't really seem like they necessarily would go together. They do, as it works out. But they're hard edge. It's like it's going along in one way, and then bang, it's going somewhere else, I mean, one of the things that I did when I joined the band is like, I think I made some of those transitions just a little bit smoother or something like that. And so, yeah.
Hi, just to let you know, we have time for about one or two more questions, okay?
Hi, I was wondering if you still have those shoes you wore in the movie, because they're really cool. And I was wondering if you went and saw David in San Francisco recently, and what you thought, if you did, what you thought of the show. I thought it was great. But
I think I do still have a pair of Capizio dance slippers, but not those. I used to get this magic shoe spray and like experiment, like those were flesh tone. But I also had some yellow ones and red, and they're really great dancing shoes. They're like, they're called Jazz Oxfords. And I did not see David's show in San Francisco, but I saw it in Chicago, which was, I'm glad I saw it in Chicago, because I saw it in a theater, which I think is a better place than the Grand, but I thought it was a fabulous show. I thought it was really great. I mean, of course, I wish that we were all doing a tour together, but I still, my hat's off to him. It's a wonderful show. Okay.
So I just wanted to say thanks for this gift. My beautiful wife is over there, and she's very nervous about what I'm going to say to you. But I saw this movie every week when I was in high school, in a very small theater outside of Washington, D.C. That's where I grew up. And then we took it all to college with us. And like you said, every time I see it, there's something new. And I guess if I have a question for you, it's when did you guys know you had something amazing? Like, when did it click?
I think that we certainly knew it when we started showing it. I mean, I think we kind of felt it. We knew the show was spectacular. And we knew that, it took a little, like there was a point where we were getting the rushes and we were kind of nervous about whether Jonathan was actually capturing what we needed. But by the point we started editing, we really knew that it was looking great. But it obviously was going to take a while, but that we knew that it would have the impact that it did. I had always hoped that we could join the Rocky Horror Picture Show or something. Which was just this phenomena at that time. I was, I didn't really want people throwing tomatoes at the screen, but I really did want them to come back and see it every week, and I was so delighted that that happened. I think that there's, Talking Heads is really almost as big now as it was ever, if not bigger. And there's been certain things that have happened, and I think that the repeat idea of Stop Making Sense has been that it's sort of insinuated itself into people's minds more. I think another thing is our songs have been featured in, This Must Be the Place was in Wall Street, in this great scene, and it just suddenly fit the scene so beautifully. Once upon, the film, I think it's Once Upon a Time, or something in Beverly Hills, the one with Jeff Bridges. Yeah, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, and it's like, you might find yourself in a shotgun shack. It just fit the movie. And now lately, Psycho Killer was in Stranger Things and in The Beast in Me, and where a psycho killer, the real psycho killer, is dancing to Psycho Killer. And Talking Heads, David's lyrics, everything was very visual. It calls up these images, and so therefore it really fits in films really, really well. And then Jonathan put my solo work and some of David's in one with Michelle Pfeiffer and Ray Liotta, Something Wild. But anyway, so I think we fit that. So I think that we've sort of seeped into everybody's consciousness in all these different ways. And finally, I think that David pointed out something which was 10 or 15 years ago, when you listen to celestial or internet radio, we would be on a channel that would say music of the 80s or music of the 70s. Now we're on playlists that there's no time stamping. We can be with very contemporary artists, very different kinds of artists. So suddenly people are being drawn in without being sort of like, I'm going back in time to this period. And I think it's sort of, people are like, wow, it still fits. It fits with, it was obviously we would fit with LCD Sound System or, a lot of bands that were influenced by us, but we seem to fit with a lot of different things. So if that really is the end, I'm happy to talk more. Is there one more? Okay.
Actually, I saw you in 1978 in West Hollywood, and I just want to thank you that you kept going.
Yes.
The music that you created, I don't think artificial intelligence could do that. So,
I don't think so either.
my question is, you guys had so many unique phases of music. Did you enjoy one particular phase?
It was hard for me not to say that Remain in Light seems extremely special. I kind of think of Fear of Music as the peak of the four-piece band. And then we have these experiments of Remain in Light and Speaking in Tongues that were just so amazing. So those, I would say that period of from Fear of Music to Speaking in Tongues, but particularly Remain in Light and Fear of Music are my favorites. But, I think that Naked is a really underappreciated album, and, we didn't tour, we hadn't toured in like 4 years or something like that. But you go back, I think the Democratic Circus is just an amazing song, so it's. The other thing is that we tried to make every one of our records different, and one of the great things about making music in the period of the Talking Heads is that we were still making albums to begin with. Albums are at the most 40 minutes long. I always say, when you used to get a new album, I remember when Jimi Hendrix's Axis Bold as Love came out, it's like you played it, you go, oh, do you want to listen to side A again? Yeah. Have you ever put a CD on a second, right again? Never. It's too long. And maybe it's something about the digital, but it's like you play a CD, it's like, oh my God. All right, well, that was great, but it's tiring. Albums had this excitement about them. Music was a different thing at that time. It was the sort of the central of the culture at that moment. And so when you make, and when bands make an album every year, nobody wants them to repeat what they did the year before. They want something new. You think about the Who, you know, you think about the album with, you know, My Generation. The next one's the Who Sell Out with pictures of, like, you know, baked beans on the cover, and, you know, then there's Tommy. They're really different records. You know, the Beatles, the Stones are all really different. Nowadays, when I was as a producer, when I produced live and we had the success of Throwing Copper, like 2.5 years went by before their next record, I think. And the record company's like, can we match that? It's got to, how do we match that? Does it have a hit like that? And so like this, all this commercial pressure is not good for bands. And I was gonna go, I thought that Live's audience on Throwing Copper was really, you know, a lot of it was like sort of girls who were about a sophomore in high school. Well, they're on their way to college now. Why would they listen to the same band? But if you listened every year to a band, then you bought into their experiments and stuff like that. We would try to experiment. We would even say that we have to record each record in a different way. You know, our first record was with Tony Bon Jovi. The next record, we went to the Bahamas and we brought in Eno. Third record, we always feel more comfortable in our loft than we do in any studio. Let's record it at our rehearsal loft. So we hired the record plant truck, and it came out on 2 Sundays because the traffic noise was less. Remain in Light is obviously, let's not compose anything until we get to the studio. Each record had, you know, a different way of recording, different people coming in, and I think that that's why it's so different. And so with that, thank you very much for coming. I really enjoyed it. Any questions? Well, thank you.
I know, right?